All right, looks like we're diving deep into some crane lifting operations, supervisor training, and certification today.
Yeah, definitely a lot to unpack here.
For sure. We've got excerpts from training manuals, study notes, even some CPCS A62 test questions.
Oh, wow, the real deal.
Yeah, so to make this deep dive really useful, I thought we could focus on those theory questions. Really break them down.
I like that idea. Let's jump in.
Okay, so one thing that pops up right away is all these safety regulations. Aller, Pure, HOSWA. It's a lot. Can you give us a quick rundown of what they mean for a crane supervisor?
Absolutely. Let's start with ULR, the lifting operations and lifting equipment regulations. That's kind of the big one. Make sure everything's planned right, supervised, and done by people who know what they're doing.
And using equipment that's been checked and is safe to use.
Exactly. Then you've got PURE, the provision and use of work equipment regulations.
Okay, so that one focuses more on the equipment itself.
Yeah, it's all about making sure the crane and everything you're using with it is suitable for the job, well-maintained, and only used by trained folks.
Got it. So LOR's kind of the big picture. Pure zooms in on the gear.
Yeah.
And then there's HOSWA, right? The Health and Safety at Work Act.
Right. HOSWA, that's like the granddaddy of workplace safety, covers everything. Basically says everyone's got to do their part to keep things safe, employers and employees.
So a safe system of work is super important then for lifting operations. What does that actually look like on the ground?
It's all about having a structured approach, right? You identify the risks, figure out how to control them, have procedures for every step of the lift, from planning to reviewing what happened afterwards.
Makes sense. So you're not just winging it. There's a plan in place.
Exactly. And that's where BS 7121 comes in.
Okay, BS 7121. That one popped up a lot in the materials. What's the deal with that?
It's the British standard for using cranes safely. Covers pretty much everything you can think of: general use, maintenance, specific types of cranes, like your mobile cranes, lorry loaders, tower cranes.
Wow, so it's kind of the Bible for crane operations.
You could say that. It's packed with best practices and safety guidelines. Very handy to have around.
Definitely seems like a required reading for a crane supervisor. Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty now. The crane itself. I gotta admit, all those parts and components can be a bit intimidating.
Oh, for sure. But once you break it down, it's not so bad. Let's start with the most obvious one, the boom.
Okay, hard to miss that one. It's that big arm that reaches up, right?
Right. Provides the reach to lift the load. You've got your telescopic booms. They can extend and retract, and fixed booms like on those big tower cranes.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about those massive concrete blocks I always see on the back? Those are counterweights, right?
Yep. They're crucial for balance. Act as a counterbalance to the load so the crane doesn't tip over.
Kind of like a seesaw. You need weight on both sides.
Exactly. Then you've got the job. Sometimes you see that attached to the main boom.
Yeah, it's like a smaller arm, right? What's that for?
It gives you extra reach, or lets you change the lifting angle, adds some flexibility to what you can do.
Gotcha. And then there are those legs that extend out from the base, the outriggers.
Ah, the outriggers. Those are your friends. They give you that extra stability, especially when you're lifting heavy stuff.
So they're like spreading out the weight, making sure the crane doesn't topple over.
Exactly, broadening that base of support.
Okay, so we've covered the boom, counterweights, jub, and outriggers. What about the actual lifting mechanism? All those ropes and pulleys and stuff.
Right, that's the hoist mechanism. It's a whole system of motors, drums, wire ropes, and sheaves that work together to lift and lower that load.
And the sheaves are those grooved wheels the rope runs through, right?
That's it. They help to guide the rope and make the hoist system more powerful.
So you can lift heavier loads with less effort. Now, at the very end of all that, you've got the hook.
The hook. Seems simple, but there are actually different types for different jobs. Standard ones for general lifting, and specialized ones like C-hooks, good for lifting coils of steel.
Ah, so you got to choose the right tool for the job. And speaking of safety, what about those safety latches on the hooks?
Those are essential. They prevent the sling or whatever you're lifting from accidentally coming off the hook. Simple, but so important.
Can't imagine what would happen if something slipped off mid-lift.
Oh,
okay, so we got the basics of the crane down. Now, what about attaching the load? That's where slings come in, right? What are the different types, and how do you pick the right one?
You got it. There are three main types: wire rope slings, chain slings, and synthetic slings. Each has its own pros and cons, depends on what you're lifting.
Okay, let's break those down. Wire rope slings.
Those are your workhorses. Strong, durable, can handle those heavy loads.
But they're not as flexible as the others, right?
Right, and you got to be careful not to kink them. Then you have your chain slings. They're tough.
Yeah, for those really rough jobs.
Exactly. Can handle high temperatures, sharp edges. but they're heavy and can stretch under pressure.
Gotcha. So wire rope for heavy duty, chain for tough conditions. What about synthetic slings?
Those are the gentle giants. Lightweight, flexible, won't damage delicate loads, but not as strong as the metal ones, and heat or sharp objects can damage them.
So it's a balancing act, figuring out which type is best for the specific load and environment.
Exactly. You got to weigh the pros and cons.
Now, once you've got your sling, how do you connect it to the crane hook?
That's where shackles come in. They're those U-shaped metal links with a pin. You've got bow shackles, good for connecting multi-leg slings.
So like when you need more than one sling to lift something.
Right. And then D-shackles, they're usually for single-point connections.
Okay, so bow shackles are like team players and D shackles are soloists.
Huh. That's a good way to remember it. And just like with hooks, you got to make sure you pick the right type of shackle for the job.
Makes sense. Now, this is the part that always kind of boggles my mind. How do you know how much weight you can actually lift safely?
That's all about the safe working load, or SWL. It's basically the maximum weight a crane can handle safely under certain conditions.
And that depends on a bunch of stuff, right?
Oh, yeah. The design of the crane, boom length, radius, boom angle, even how those outriggers are set up. Lots to consider.
So it's not just a simple number. It changes depending on how you're using the crane.
Exactly. And as the crane supervisor, you need to be able to calculate the SWL for every single lift. You got to get that right or things can go very wrong.
No pressure then.
Nope. Safety first. But before you can even calculate the SWL, you need to know how much the load itself weighs.
Okay, how do you figure that out?
Sometimes the load comes with a tear sheet, basically tells you the weight. Other times you might use weigh load cells. Those measure the weight during a test lift.
What if you don't have those?
Well, you can try to calculate it using volume and density. You measure the volume of the load and multiply it by the density of whatever it's made of.
So if I was lifting a big concrete block, I'd measure its length, width, height.
To get the volume, yeah.
Right.
And then look up the density of concrete, plug it into the formula.
Cool. Okay, so we've got the weight of the load figured out. What next?
Now you need to find its center of gravity, the cog.
Oh yeah, cog. That sounds familiar from physics class. Why is it so important for lifting?
It's basically the point where the load's weight is evenly distributed. It affects how stable the lift will be. If the cog is off, the load could tip over.
So for something perfectly symmetrical, like a cube, the cog is right in the middle. But what if it's an irregular shape?
That's when things get trickier. You might have to break it down into smaller sections, calculate the cog for each, then figure out the overall cog.
Sounds like some geometry and physics homework.
A bit. But there are tools and techniques to help. The important thing is to always be mindful of the cog. Make sure that load is balanced before you lift it.
Got it. Cog is key. Now, what about the boom itself? Does the position of the boom affect the lift?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Boom length, radius, and angle all play a role. It's all interconnected.
Okay, let's start with boom length. Does a longer boom mean you could lift more?
Actually, it's the opposite. A longer boom means less lifting capacity.
Really? Why is that?
It's about leverage. The longer the boom, the more stress on the crane. Think about holding a weight at arm's length. It gets harder the further out you go.
Ah, that makes sense. So it's a trade-off between reach and power. What about the radius? How does that work in?
The radius is that horizontal distance between the crane's center and the load. Larger radius also means less lifting capacity. Again, it's that leverage thing.
So the further away the load is, the harder it is to lift.
Exactly. And then you've got the boom angle. Steeper angle, closer to vertical, generally means you can lift more.
So if I want to lift the absolute max weight, I should aim for a straight-up boom.
Well, within safe limits, yes. But remember, never exceed the crane's SWL, even with a steep boom angle.
Safety first. Okay, so you've covered the crane components, slings, shackles, cog, boom length, radius, angle. It's a lot to keep track of.
It is. Lifting's a complex operation, lots of variables to juggle, and that's why planning is so crucial.
Planning. I mean, it seems pretty straightforward. Attach the load, lift it up.
Oh, there's a lot more to it than that. We need to talk about lift plans and method statements. Those are essential.
Okay, let's dive into those.
A lift plan is like your blueprint for the whole operation. Outlines all the key details. The load, the crane, ground conditions, personnel, environment, everything.
So it's like a super detailed checklist.
Exactly. Make sure you've considered everything. Then you've got the method statement. That's like your step-by-step guide. Outlines the sequence of events, the equipment you'll use, safety measures, communication plan.
So the lift plan is the big picture, and the method statement zooms in on the specific.
Exactly. Both are super important for safety and efficiency.
Okay, that makes sense. So what are some of the key things that go into these planning documents? The materials mentioned an exclusion zone. What's that all about?
The exclusion zone is basically a no-go area around the crane. You got to keep unauthorized people and equipment out of there.
So it's like a safety perimeter to protect people from falling objects or swinging crane parts.
Exactly. And it needs to be clearly marked so everyone knows to stay clear. Barriers, signs, tape, whatever it takes.
Makes sense. What about access routes? Why are those important in the planning process?
You got to think about how the crane, other vehicles, and people are going to get to and from the lifting area. Those routes need to be clear, wide enough, and free of hazards.
So it's not just about the immediate area around the crane, it's about the whole pathway to get there.
Exactly. And of course, we can't forget about emergency procedures.
Oh, right. That's got to be crucial. What kind of emergency procedures should be included?
You need a plan for all sorts of scenarios. Equipment failure, bad weather, even a medical emergency.
So you got to think about what could go wrong and have a plan in place just in case.
Exactly. Know your emergency stop signals, have an evacuation plan, and make sure everyone knows who to contact in an emergency.
Okay, exclusion zones, access routes, emergency procedures.
What about the environment? Seems like weather could really impact a lifting operation.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Wind, rain, snow, ice, those can all throw a wrench in the works. So if it's a super windy day, you might have to postpone the lift.
Yep. High winds can make the load swing like crazy and put a lot of stress on the crane. Rain can make things slippery, especially if you're relying on those outriggers for stability.
And I imagine snow and ice would make things even worse.
Definitely. Always got to check the weather forecast and be ready to adjust the lift plan if needed. Safety first.
Okay, environmental factors, got it. Now, what about hazards in the area? What kind of things should a crane supervisor be on the lookout for?
Lots of potential hazards out there. One of the big ones is underground utilities. You know, gas pipes, water mains, electrical cables.
Oh, yeah, those could be a nasty surprise if you hit one. How do you even know where they are?
You got to get your hands on some utility drawings or do a utility survey before you even start planning. There's also ground-penetrating radar that can help locate stuff.
So, underground utilities, check. What other hazards are we dealing with?
Overhead power lines, those are a big one. Contact with those can be fatal, so got to maintain a safe distance at all times.
Yeah, seems obvious, but I can see how it could happen if you're not paying attention. How do you know what a safe distance is?
Check the regulations and guidelines for your area. There are also online tools that can help calculate the minimum safe distance based on the voltage in the crane you're using.
Okay, underground utilities, overhead power lines. Any other hazards lurking out there?
We also got to watch out for unstable ground. If the ground's not solid, it could collapse or shift under the crane.
So basically, you need to make sure the ground can handle the weight of the crane, A&D, the load.
Exactly. You can do soil tests to figure out how much weight the ground can handle, and you can use spreader mats under the outriggers.
Spreader mats, those are like those big, flat pieces of wood or metal you sometimes see under the outriggers?
That's them. They spread out the weight over a bigger area, kind of like snowshoes for the crane.
Ah, that makes sense. Oh, okay, unstable ground, got it. So we've got a lot of potential hazards to consider when planning a lift. How do you keep track of all that and make sure nothing gets missed?
That's where the risk assessment process comes in. It's a structured way to identify and manage those hazards.
Okay, break that down for me. What are the steps involved?
First, you got to identify all the hazards. Look at every part of the operation, the crane, the load, the environment, the people, anything that could potentially cause harm.
So be thorough and think about everything that could go wrong. Then what?
Then you got to assess the risks. Figure out how likely each hazard is to occur and how serious the consequences would be if it did.
So you're kind of ranking the hazards based on their potential for causing trouble.
Exactly. Then you got to come up with control measures. Ways to eliminate or reduce the risks to an acceptable level.
So that could involve changing how you do things, using different equipment, putting up barriers, training people better, or making sure everyone has the right PPE.
Exactly. The specific control measures will depend on the hazard and the level of risk. And finally, you got to monitor and review, make sure those control measures are actually working.
So it's not a one-time thing. You got to keep checking and adjusting as needed.
Absolutely. Things change. New hazards can pop up. You learn from experience. It's a dynamic process.
Wow, that risk assessment process sounds pretty involved.
It is, but it's super important for keeping everyone safe.
Okay, so we've got planning, hazards, risk assessment. What else do we need to cover?
Communication. Can't forget about communication.
Right. Seems kind of obvious, but why is communication so crucial in this context?
It's how everything flows smoothly and safely. The crane operator needs to know what to do. The slinger signaler needs to know when to attach and detach the load. Everyone needs to be in sync.
Okay, so what are the main ways people communicate during a lift?
You've got your hand signals and your radio communication.
Hand signals, those are those standardized ones, right?
Yep, they're like a universal language on the lifting site. Hoist, lower, swing, travel, stop.
Everyone needs to know those signals.
Makes sense. So if the slinger needs the operator to lower the load, they'd use a specific hand signal for lower.
Exactly. And the operator would repeat the signal back just to make sure they understood correctly. Okay, double checking. Good idea. What about radio communication? When do you use that?
Well, hand signals aren't practical. Maybe the operator's too far away, or there's too much noise, or other distractions.
So it's a backup system when you can't rely on visuals.
Exactly. But even when using the radio, you got to be clear and concise, avoid jargon, and always repeat back instructions to confirm you got it right.
No room for misinterpretation. It sounds like communication is just as important as all the technical stuff.
Absolutely. It's the glue that holds everything together.
All right, so we've covered planning, hazards, risk assessment, communication. I'm starting to feel a lot more informed about what a crane supervisor actually does, but I'm also realizing how much responsibility is involved.
Oh, yeah. It's a big responsibility, but it's also a really important role.
So before we move on, can we recap some of the key things a crane supervisor needs to do to make sure a lift is done safely?
Sure. Before the lift even starts, there are 3 main things you got to do. Verify the equipment setup, check the load conditions, and make sure your personnel are ready to go.
Okay, let's break those down one by one. What does it mean to verify the equipment setup?
First things first. Make sure the crane is positioned correctly, just like it says in the lift plan.
Okay, so following the plan exactly, what else?
Make sure those outriggers are fully extended and properly supported, and that the crane itself is level.
Right, got to have a solid base.
Then give the crane a good visual inspection. Check the cables, hooks, sheaves, everything. Look for any damage, wear, or defects.
So you're looking for anything that could potentially cause problems during the lift.
Exactly. And if you find anything, no matter how small, report it right away to the appointed person.
Okay, so you're not taking any chances. What if everything looks good visually?
Don't stop there. You also got to make sure those safety systems are all working properly.
The safety systems, like what exactly?
The rated capacity indicator, the RCI, that's a big one.
The RCI, what does that do?
It basically tells the operator how much weight the crane can handle in that specific setup. It's like the crane's brain for safety.
Ah, that makes sense. What other safety systems are we talking about?
Any anti-collision systems, the overhoist limit switch, the load radius indicator. You got to make sure they're all doing their job.
Okay, so it's not enough to just glance at the crane. You got to really make sure it's in tip-top shape and all the safety features are functional.
Exactly. No cutting corners when it comes to safety.
All right, equipment setup, check. What's next on our pre-lift checklist?
Next up is checking the load conditions. Make sure the load itself is safe to lift and properly prepped.
What did that involve?
Triple check the weight of the load, confirm its center of gravity, and make sure you're using the right lifting accessories.
So the slings, shackles, all that.
Right. You got to make sure they're strong enough and configured correctly for that specific load, and double check that the load's balanced.
Right. Wouldn't want it tipping over mid-lift?
Nope. Stable load, safe load.
Okay, so we've checked the equipment and the load. What's the last thing on our pre-lift checklist?
The people. You got to make sure everyone involved is qualified, competent, and properly equipped for the job.
Right. You can't just have anyone wandering around the lifting area.
Exactly. We're talking about the crane operator, the slinger signaler, anyone working in that zone. Make sure they have the right training, certifications, and understand the plan.
And that they're wearing all the proper safety gear, of course.
Absolutely. Helmets, gloves, safety glasses, high-vis vests, whatever they need to stay safe.
Okay, so it's your job to make sure everyone's qualified, competent, and protected. What if you have concerns about someone?
You bring it up immediately to the appointed person. They have the final say on who's allowed to work on the lift.
Okay, so no messing around when it comes to safety.
Nope. Safety is paramount. Always.
Well, I'm definitely feeling a lot more prepared now than I was before we started this deep dive.
Glad to hear it. It's all about giving you the knowledge and skills you need to succeed in this role.
Now I'm curious, what happens if something goes wrong during the lift? What if things don't go according to plan?
That's a great question. Even with all the planning in the world, unexpected things can happen. We call those deviations from the lift plan, and it's important to know how to handle them.
Deviations. What kind of things are we talking about?
Could be anything, really. Maybe the load turns out to be heavier than you thought, or there's a sudden equipment failure, or the weather changes unexpectedly, or a new hazard pops up in the lifting zone. Even a medical emergency could throw things off.
So it's about being able to think on your feet and adapt to the situation.
Exactly. And the most important thing is to stop the operation immediately. Don't try to push through it or hope for the best.
Right, safety first. So you hit the pause button. Then what?
Then you got to notify the appointed person. They're ultimately responsible for the safety of the whole operation.
Okay, so why is it so important to notify them? Can't you just make the adjustments and carry on?
You're responsible for making sure the lift plan is followed, but any changes to that plan have to be approved by the appointed person.
Okay, so you got to get the green light from the person in charge before making any changes.
Exactly. It's about maintaining a clear chain of command and making sure everyone's on the same page.
Got it. So I've stopped the operation and notified the appointed person. What happens next?
You and the appointed person got to work together to figure out what went wrong and come up with a safe solution.
So it's a team effort to problem solve.
Exactly. You might need to reevaluate the load, inspect the equipment, gather more info about the hazard, or even revise the whole lift plan.
Okay, so you come up with a new plan of attack. What's the final step?
You got to rebrief the whole team. Everyone needs to be aware of the changes and how their role might be affected. Communication is key, especially when things get a little hairy.
Yeah, sounds like flexibility and being able to adapt are crucial skills for a crane supervisor. You got to be able to think on your feet and make good decisions under pressure.
Okay, so we've covered what to do when things go wrong during a lift. What about after a lift is completed successfully? Is there anything else a crane supervisor needs to do? Even after a successful lift, the job's not quite done. You got to take some time to reflect on the operation, see what went well and what could be improved.
So it's like a post-game analysis for lifting operations.
I like that analogy. It's all about learning from experience, you know.
What kind of things should I be thinking about when I'm reflecting on a lift?
Well, you want to consider both the positive and the negative aspects.
Okay, let's start with the positive. What are some examples of things that might have gone well?
Well, did everyone stick to the lift plan and method statement? Was there good communication and coordination? Was the lift completed safely and efficiently without any incidents?
So basically, did everything go according to plan?
Exactly. If so, that's great, but you still want to think about what could be even better next time.
Okay, so even in a successful lift, there's always room for improvement. What about the flip side? What are some things that might have gone wrong even if the lift was ultimately completed?
Well, were there any deviations from the plan, even small ones? Were there any equipment issues like malfunctions or unexpected wear and tear? Did anyone have any communication breakdowns or misunderstandings?
So you're looking for any little hiccups that might have happened along the way.
Right. Even near misses or any unsafe practices that you observed. The goal is to learn from every experience and make things safer and smoother next time.
Got it. So I've reflected on the lift and identified both the good and the bad. What do I do with that information?
You write it all down in a post-lift report.
A post-lift report. What's the purpose of that?
It's a record of what happened, so you can refer back to it later. It also allows you to analyze what worked and what didn't, and make recommendations for improvement.
So it's a way to document the lessons learned. What goes into a post-lift report?
Well, you start with an introduction, just a quick overview of the lift. Then you have a summary of the operation, including the lift plan, the equipment used, and the personnel involved.
Okay, so the who, what, when, where of the lift.
Exactly. Then comes the performance analysis. That's where you really dig into what went well and what didn't, and why.
Okay, so that's where you get into the nitty-gritty details.
Yep. And finally, you have a section for recommendations. Based on your analysis, you suggest ways to improve procedures, equipment, or training in the future.
And so we have 68 theory questions for this one.
Okay.
And we're going to sort of use these as jumping off points for our deep dive.
All right. I like it.
Yeah, so rather than just going through the questions one by one and just giving an answer,
Right.
we're going to kind of use them to just explore the topic a little bit more in depth.
Excellent. I'm excited.
Yeah, so let's just jump into it with the very first question. So this one asks about the purpose of the overhoist limit switch.
So that's a critical safety feature on a crane.
Right.
that prevents the hook block from being pulled up too high
Yeah.
and colliding with the sheaves or the boom head.
Yeah, so it's just like a last line of defense in case something goes wrong.
Exactly. It's like that safety net that prevents a really catastrophic accident.
Okay, cool. So question 2 kind of shifts gears a little bit. And it asks how a crane supervisor can ensure repeat business with a client.
So this is where your soft skills come in.
Yeah.
It's about building that trust and rapport with the client.
So it's not just about, knowing the technical aspects of it, but also about the people skill.
Exactly. You want to be reliable, efficient, communicate well, and prioritize safety. That's what keeps clients coming back.
Okay, good stuff.
Yeah.
Now, question 3 gets straight to the point. To whom should the appointed person give all the details involving the lifting operation?
All those details should be given to the crane supervisor.
Okay.
Clear communication is key here. The crane supervisor needs all the information to make sure the lift is carried out safely.
Makes sense.
Mm.
Question 4 focuses on the operator encountering a new crane model. It asks, what do regulations like LOD 98 and other guidance require the operator to have?
So this highlights the importance of ongoing training and competency.
Yep.
If you're faced with a new crane model, you need to receive the proper instruction and training before operating it.
Yeah, so no winging it, basically.
Exactly. Safety comes first.
Okay, cool. Question 5 puts us right on a busy site. If setting up to lift loads near a pedestrianized area, what main factor needs to be taken into account?
Pedestrian safety is paramount in that situation.
Right.
You absolutely need to establish clear exclusion zones around the lifting area using barriers and signage.
Okay, so keep them separate.
Exactly. Keep those paths separate to minimize the risk.
All right, question 6 broadens the scope a little bit. It asks for 6 typical subject areas that should be covered in a site induction.
Site inductions. Those are crucial for setting the stage for a safe work environment.
Yeah, for sure.
You need to cover things like site access and egress accident and emergency reporting procedures, restricted areas, safety signs, the site layout, and waste handling.
So a lot of general safety procedures.
Exactly. It's all about making sure everyone's on the same page from the moment they step on site.
Makes sense. Okay, question 7 gets a little technical. What advantage is there in increasing the number of falls on a hook block?
Think of falls as the lengths of rope or chain supporting the load. Increasing the number of falls basically spreads the weight out more evenly, allowing you to lift heavier loads safely within the crane's limits.
Oh, I see. So it's like spreading the weight across more ropes.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. Question 8 asks about 2 possible penalties for not following legal requirements when using a crane.
Well, failing to comply with legislation can have some serious consequences.
Yeah.
You could face prosecution, hefty fines, or even have your operation shut down by the HSE.
Wow, so it's not something to take lightly.
Definitely not. Safety violations are a big deal.
All right. Question 9 asks if a heavy load is being slewed at too high a speed over at least 180 degrees, what 2 factors must the operator and signaler take into account?
So slewing refers to the rotating movement of the crane.
Yeah.
And when you're moving a heavy load at speed, momentum becomes a major factor.
Okay.
The operator and signaler need to work together to anticipate the stopping distance and time and also account for any potential load swing.
Right, because you don't want the load to, swing out of control. Yeah.
Exactly. It's all about control and precision.
All right, so question 10 is about qualifications.
Yeah.
How can a qualification or card benefit a crane supervisor?
Well, a recognized qualification demonstrates your commitment to safety and best practices.
Makes sense.
It shows clients and employers that you have the knowledge and skills to manage lifting operations effectively.
So it's like a stamp of approval.
Exactly. It can really boost your credibility and open up more opportunities.
All right, great question. 11 broadens our perspective a bit. State 6 environmental factors that can affect an external lifting operation.
The great outdoors. Always a factor.
Right.
Things like wind fog, rain, thunderstorms, ice, and snow can all impact visibility, ground stability, and the overall safety of the operation.
Yeah, so you have to be prepared for anything.
Absolutely. You're at the mercy of the elements.
Okay, question 12 brings us back to the fundamental state why there must be a safe system of work.
This is all about minimizing risks and ensuring everyone's safety.
Okay.
It's a legal requirement under the Health and Safety at Work Act, and it ensures that all lifting activities are properly planned, supervised, and executed.
So a framework for safe operations.
Exactly.
All right, question 13 gets practical. Give 2 methods of obtaining the accurate weight of a load.
You can usually find this information on the loads tear sheet or in the manufacturer's data.
Okay.
If that's not available, you can use a weigh load cell during a trial lift.
So either documentation or direct measurement?
Precisely.
Question 14. What is the purpose of a risk assessment?
Risk assessments are all about identifying potential hazards, evaluating the level of risk, and determining appropriate control measures.
Okay.
It's a proactive approach to safety, trying to prevent accidents before they happen.
All right, question 15 gets serious. What are the possible outcomes if facing prosecution for not complying with legislation and regulations?
Well, the consequences can be quite severe,
Yeah.
ranging from a case dismissal to substantial fines, and in some cases, even imprisonment.
Wow, so definitely not worth the risk.
Excellent.
Question 16 asks, what is meant by the lifting capacity of the crane and who determines it?
The lifting capacity is the maximum weight the crane can safely lift under specific conditions.
Okay.
And this is determined by the manufacturer.
So it's not just a suggestion, it's a hard limit.
Exactly. Exceeding the lifting capacity puts everyone at risk.
All right, question 17 asks about the 4 different types or levels of disciplinary actions that can be applied to operators who don't comply with legislation and regulations.
Well, there are various levels of consequences depending on the severity of the violation.
Okay.
Employers can issue warnings, suspensions, or even dismissals.
Right.
And judicial bodies can impose fines or imprisonment.
So a whole range of consequences.
But yeah, it all depends on the specific situation and the level of risk involved.
Makes sense. Okay, question 18 asks, how is the safe working load for multi-leg slings determined?
That's determined using the uniform load method,
Okay.
which takes into account the angle of the slings and how the weight is distributed across multiple legs.
Okay, so it's like a specialized calculation.
Exactly. You need to make sure the load is balanced and within the sling's capacity.
All right, question 19, give 3 examples of how excessive rain can affect an external lifting operation when using a mobile crane.
Rain can really throw a wrench into things.
I bet.
It can soften the ground, reduce visibility, and make surfaces slippery.
So it impacts everything.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It affects stability, visibility, and creates a greater risk of slips and falls.
All right, question 20. What are the types of warning that an RCI will indicate?
So the RCI, or rated capacity indicator, is like a safety watchdog.
Okay.
It monitors the load weight, and if it approaches or exceeds the limit, it'll typically issue warnings through lights and alarms.
Sounds like a built-in safety feature.
Exactly. It gives everyone a heads up if things are getting too heavy.
All right, that's good.
Ah.
Question 21, name 3 factors that determine the safe working load of the crane.
3 key factors come into play there.
Okay.
The length of the boom, the radius at which the load is being lifted, and the angle of the boom.
So it's not just about the crane's strength, but also how it's positioned.
Exactly.
Okay, question 22 asks, what is the purpose of a method statement and what is required of the operator?
A method statement is a step-by-step guide for safely performing a task.
Yeah.
And the operator is legally required to follow it precisely.
So it's like a detailed instruction manual.
Precisely.
Okay, cool. Question 23 asks, what is the minimum recommended distance that is allowed between the counterweights of the crane and another object or structure?
According to BS 7121, that distance should be at least 600 millimeters.
Okay.
That ensures enough clearance for the crane to move safely without collisions.
Makes sense. Question 24, state the safe procedure to be followed before lifting or lowering a load down a shaft or excavation.
So before you start, you need to lower the empty hook down to check the clearance and make sure there are no obstructions.
Right. So you're checking the path is clear.
Exactly. And you also need to check the hoist drum to make sure you have enough rope or chain to complete the lift safely.
So double checking everything before you commit.
It's all about careful preparation in those situations.
All right. Well, that's a good place to take a little break.
Sounds good.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground already, but there's still plenty more to explore.
Can't wait to dive back in.
All right, we'll be right back.
Okay, so question 25 dives into lifting accessories, asking about the maximum angle for bow shackles used as a pair on a crane hook.
Oh, shackles.
Yeah.
Right? Those U-shaped things with the pin.
Exactly. So when you're using them as a pair on a crane hook, the maximum included angle should never exceed 90 degrees.
Okay. So why 90 degrees? Is there something special about that?
Going beyond that puts way too much stress on the shackles,
Oh, I see.
which weakens them and could lead to them failing.
Gotcha. So like bending a paperclip too far.
Yeah, kind of like that. You don't want to push them past their limits.
Right. Makes sense.
Huh.
Okay, question 26 is about pre-use inspections. What are 3 actions or stages that a crane operator undertakes during those?
It's like a pilot's pre-flight check. You got to make sure everything is in tip-top shape before you take off.
Right. So what are those checks?
First, the operator needs to thoroughly inspect the crane according to the manufacturer's recommendations.
So that's the checking part.
Yep. Then they need to log these checks, documenting the date and time of the inspection.
And that's recording.
Right. And lastly, they need to report any defects immediately, no matter how small.
Okay. So checking, recording, and reporting.
Exactly. It's a system that helps keep everything running smoothly and safely.
Okay, cool. Question 27 asks for 2 duties of the crane operator.
So this is about their core responsibilities during a lift.
Right.
First, they need to set up the crane according to the manufacturer's instructions and the lift plan.
So making sure the crane is ready to go.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And second, they need to operate the crane strictly according to the lift plan and the safe system of work.
So following the rules, basically.
Yep. All about safety and precision.
All right. Question 28. What is the definition of a hazard, or how can it be described?
A hazard is anything that has the potential to cause harm.
Okay, so pretty broad.
It could be a physical object, a work practice, an environmental factor, pretty much anything that could put someone at risk.
Gotcha. So recognizing those hazards is the first step.
Exactly. You need to know what to look for.
Okay, question 29 asks, what do the work at height regulations require of crane supervisors?
This is about ensuring the safety of anyone working at height, not just the operator.
So what are their responsibilities?
They need to make sure operators aren't at risk of falling when accessing the cab or doing maintenance at height.
So thinking beyond the crane itself.
Exactly. It's about considering all the potential risks associated with the operation.
All right, question 30 is about the validity of a thorough examination for a lifting accessory.
To ensure the safety of things like slings and shackles, they need to be thoroughly examined every 6 months.
So regular checkups are crucial.
Absolutely. You need to catch any wear and tear or damage before it becomes a problem.
Right, makes sense. Okay, question 31 asks for a design of accessory hook that is exempt from being fitted with a safety catch.
That would be the C-hook, sometimes called the cargo of Liverpool hook.
Okay, so why is it exempt?
It has a unique design that's historically been used for handling specific types of cargo, and it doesn't require a safety catch.
Ah, interesting. So an exception to the rule.
Exactly. It's a special case.
All right, question 32 asks for 4 requirements for ensuring the stability of mobile cranes on site.
Modal crane stability is paramount. You don't want any surprises there.
Right. So what do you need to do?
First, you need to ensure the ground beneath the crane is firm and level.
Okay, so a good foundation.
Exactly. Then all outriggers need to be fully extended and properly supported.
So the crane is sitting securely.
Yep. And the crane itself needs to be level both longitudinally and transversely.
No wonky cranes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And lastly, when those outriggers are deployed, all wheels should be clear of the ground.
So the weight is fully on the outriggers.
Precisely. It's all about creating a stable and secure base for lifting operations.
Okay, good stuff. Question 33 is about documentation. Name 4 items that must be recorded when a thorough examination on a lifting appliance has been carried out.
Thorough examination records are crucial for tracking the history of a crane.
Right, so what goes in those records?
You need the employer's name and address, the location of the examination, the name of the person who conducted the examination, and a detailed description of the crane itself.
So all the essential details.
Exactly. It's like a medical record for the crane, keeping track of its health over time.
Interesting. Question 34 is about communication. If radios are to be used during the lifting operations, what 5 actions and checks must be made before use?
Clear communication is absolutely essential in this line of work.
Yeah. One wrong word and things could go south.
Exactly. So before you start using radios, you need to make sure everyone knows how to operate them properly.
Okay. Basic training.
Yep. Then check that the batteries are charged and you have spares. Select the correct frequency, verify signal strength, and assign clear call signs.
So making sure the lines of communication are open and reliable.
Exactly. No room for miscommunication when you're dealing with heavy loads.
All right. Question 35 asks us to differentiate between an employing and user organization.
So the employing organization is the one that needs the lift done. They might hire a crane directly or contract it out.
Okay.
The user organization is the one that actually plans and manages the lifting operation.
So it's about who needs the lift and who's responsible for carrying it out.
Exactly.
Okay, question 36 brings us back to tower cranes. A tower crane has been delivered to site, assembled, and configured for lifting. What must be carried out before lifting starts, And by whom?
Before it can be used, a newly assembled tower crane needs to be thoroughly inspected.
Okay, to make sure everything is put together properly.
Exactly. And this inspection is usually done by an independent engineer.
So an extra layer of safety.
Yep. It's all about making sure everything is up to standard before any lifting begins.
Makes sense. Question 37 follows up on that. On a tower crane, where must the load radius diagram be located, and what information must it contain?
That diagram is a crucial reference for safe operation.
Right.
It needs to be prominently displayed at the base of the tower crane, and it shows the crane's safe working load at various radii and for different configurations.
So it's like a quick guide to the crane's capabilities.
Exactly. It helps the operator and supervisor make sure they're operating within safe limits.
Okay. Question 38 is about sling angles again.
Yeah.
What is the maximum recommended angle for single-leg slings when used as a pair?
When you're using two single-leg slings to lift a load, the maximum recommended angle between them is 90 degrees.
Okay, so another important rule of thumb.
Yep. Exceeding that angle can put too much stress on the slings and increase the risk of failure.
So sticking to those angles is crucial.
Absolutely. It's all about working within the limits of the equipment.
All right, question 39 focuses on the crane hire company. When they hire out a crane name, two main legal requirements they must meet regarding the crane and driver.
First, they need to provide a crane that's in good working order with all the necessary certifications and inspections up to date.
So making sure the crane is safe to use.
Exactly. And second, they need to provide a competent and qualified driver with the appropriate licenses.
So they're vouching for both the machine and the person operating it.
Precisely.
Yeah.
They're responsible for ensuring both are up to standard.
All right, question 40 asks, what does the Health and Safety at Work Act require employers to do with regards specifically to plant?
That act requires employers to provide and maintain safe plant and equipment.
Okay, so that includes cranes.
Cranes, forklifts, any machinery or tools used in the place.
So a broad responsibility for workplace safety.
Exactly. It's about creating a safe environment for everyone.
All right, question 41 asks, in which applications are single-leg slings rated with their safe working load?
Single-leg slings are only rated with their SWL when they're used vertically.
Okay, so if the sling is at an angle.
You need to reduce the capacity to account for the increased stress.
Right, so the angle changes the game.
Exactly. You need to adjust accordingly.
Question 42 asks, how does the deflection of the boom on a modal crane or jibe affect the lift?
So when a boom deflects or bends under load, the radius of the lift increases.
Oh, I see.
And that change can affect the crane's lifting capacity.
Right. So you need to account for that deflection.
Exactly. It's a subtle but important factor.
Okay, question 43 is about multi-crane operations. Two cranes are working in the same vicinity that encroach the operating radius of each. What actions would the lift plan or method statement normally specify?
When you have multiple cranes working close together, coordination is key.
Yeah, you want them bumping into each other.
Exactly. So the lift plan or method statement needs to outline clear communication procedures, designate a supervisor or coordinator, and set limits on movements to prevent collisions.
So a lot of planning and communication.
Absolutely. It's all about safety and efficiency.
All right, question 44 asks, if a crane is out of level, what effect will it have on the radius?
Being out of level can either increase or decrease the radius depending on which way the crane is tilting.
Oh, interesting.
And that change in radius affects the lifting capacity and stability.
So leveling the crane is crucial.
Absolutely. It's a fundamental step.
Okay. Question 45 is about environmental awareness. Name 3 ways in which an operator can minimize their impact on the environment while using a crane.
Operators can be mindful of the environment in a few ways.
Okay.
First, by operating the crane, efficiently minimizing unnecessary movements, and idling.
So reducing fuel consumption.
Exactly. Second, by operating at lower engine speeds to further reduce emissions.
Okay. So being mindful of the noise and fumes.
Right. And lastly, by ensuring the crane is well maintained to prevent any leaks or spills.
So no oil slicks.
Exactly. It's about being responsible and minimizing your footprint.
All right. Question 46 is about a major safety hazard. What determines the minimum distances that any part of plant and machinery has to be kept from overhead electricity lines, and explain why a distance should be kept?
The minimum safe distance from overhead power lines depends on the voltage of the lines and the type of support structure.
Okay.
High voltage electricity can arc across gaps, especially in wet conditions.
So it's not just about touching the lines.
Exactly. It's about staying clear of that invisible danger zone.
Right. And why is that distance so important?
Because getting too close could lead to electrocution or fires. It's a serious risk.
Definitely not something to mess around with. Okay, question 47 presents a situation where the plan needs to change. During the lifting operation, part of the task cannot be carried out as detailed in the lift plan. What initially must happen to the lifting operation, and who authorizes any changes?
If something in the plan needs to change, the first step is to stop the operation immediately.
Okay, so a pause for reassessment.
Exactly. Then any changes to the plan need to be authorized by the appointed person.
So it goes back to the top.
Yep, they have the final say on any deviations from the original plan.
Makes sense. Question 48 deals with a change in personnel. A replacement crane driver has been supplied to continue the lift. What must they be made aware of before further lifting can take place?
Before a new driver takes over, they need a thorough briefing.
Okay, what kind of briefing?
They need to know about the lift plan, the load, any hazards, the current status of the lift, and any specific instructions from the appointed person.
So a complete handover of information.
Exactly. It's crucial for a smooth and safe transition.
All right, question 49 dives into safety procedures. Name 5 requirements that must be followed if accessing the end of the job for maintenance purposes.
Accessing the job is a specialized task, and there are strict safety protocols.
Right, so one of those.
First, the personnel involved need to be trained and authorized.
So not just anyone can go up there.
Nope. They need the proper qualifications. Then they need to wear a properly fitted harness.
Okay, so fall protect.
Exactly. And they need to use designated walkways, no shortcuts allowed.
Got it.
And they need to have a reliable retrieval system in place in case of an emergency.
So a way to get back down safely.
Exactly. It's all about minimizing risk in a potentially hazardous situation.
Makes sense. Question 50 asks, who is responsible for providing the contractor with written details of the work to be done?
That responsibility falls on the employing organization.
Okay, so they need to give clear instructions.
Exactly. The contractor needs all the details to plan and execute the lift safely.
All right, question 51 is about the hoist drum. According to BS 7121, Part 1, what is the minimum number of allowable turns on the hoist drum? And who decides the actual minimum for a given model of crane?
BS 7121 specifies a minimum of 2 turns of rope remaining on the drum at all times.
Okay, so a general safety rule.
Yep, but the manufacturer gets to decide the actual minimum for each crane model.
So they take into account the specifics of the hoisting system.
Exactly.
Okay, question 52, which part of BS 7121 is specific to mobile cranes?
If you're working with mobile cranes, BS 7121 Part 3 is your go-to guide.
All right, so that's where you find the specialized information.
Yep. It covers everything from stability and ground conditions to load monitoring and risk mitigation.
Okay, good to know. Question 53 gets to the heart of the matter. Who has overall control of the lifting operation?
The appointed person is in charge. They have the ultimate responsibility for making sure everything goes smoothly and safely.
So they're the boss.
Exactly. They make the decisions, approve changes, and oversee all aspects of the lift.
All right, question 54 asks, what 3 main duties of the Health and Safety at Work Act must employees follow?
That act requires employees to take reasonable care for their own safety and the safety of others.
Okay, so being responsible for yourself and those around you.
Exactly. They also need to cooperate with their employer's safety efforts.
So working together.
Yep. And they can't interfere with any safety procedures.
So no messing around with the rules.
Exactly. It's all about creating a safe and responsible work environment.
Okay, question 55 is about a specific safety factor. What is the factor of safety when lifting personnel?
Lifting people is a high-risk operation, so you need a higher level of safety.
Right, so what's the factor?
The factor of safety for personnel lifting is 2.1.
Okay, what does that mean?
It means the lifting equipment's braking strength needs to be at least twice the weight of the people being lifted.
Oh, I see, so double the safety margin.
Exactly. You don't want to take any chances when you're lifting people.
All right, question 56 is about hand signals. What is the meaning of this hand signal being demonstrated by the tester?
This is about understanding those standardized hand signals used in crane operations.
Right, so like a universal language.
Exactly. The tester is likely showing a signal from BS 7121, which outlines those signals for clear and safe communication.
Makes sense. Okay, question 57. Give 2 methods of obtaining the center of gravity on an unbalanced load.
You can either calculate it or measure it.
Okay, so how do you calculate it?
By carefully considering the weight and distribution of the load's components.
And how do you measure it?
By doing a trial lift with a weigh load cell and observing how the load balances.
So either careful calculations or a hands-on approach.
Exactly. It depends on the situation and the resources available.
Question 58 asks, why is it important to ensure the wheels are clear of the ground when outriggers are employed?
When you're using outriggers, you want to make sure the crane's weight is fully transferred onto them.
Right. So why is it important for the wheels to be off the ground?
If the wheels are still touching the ground, they might share some of the load,
Oh, I see.
and that could overload the outriggers or make the crane unstable.
Gotcha. So it's about maximizing stability
Mhm.
by putting the crane fully on its outriggers.
Exactly. You want a solid foundation for lifting.
Okay. Question 59 is about crane movement. If a mobile crane on blocked duties is slowing through 180 degrees and is unladen, what can cause a change of ground loading in each stabilizer?
So blocked duties means the crane is set up on outriggers with the wheels off the ground. And even though the crane is unladen, the movement of the counterweight as it slews will cause a change in ground loading on each outrigger.
So the weight distribution is constantly shifting.
Exactly. It's a dynamic process.
All right. Question 60. When and why are axle or suspension locks fitted to most mobile cranes?
Axle or suspension locks are usually engaged when a mobile crane is performing blocked duties.
Okay, so when it's set up on outriggers.
Exactly. And the reason is to prevent any movement or oscillation in the axles or suspension.
So it's about keeping the crane platform stable.
Precisely. You don't want any wobbling when you're lifting heavy loads.
Makes sense. Question 61 asks us to do some calculations. Describe how to calculate the area of support beneath a crane outrigger, which gives maximum possible safeguards against ground subsidence.
To do that, you need to consider the combined weight of the crane and the maximum load.
Okay.
And divide that by the maximum allowable ground bearing pressure.
And that gives you the area.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It tells you the minimum area needed under each outrigger to prevent the ground from sinking.
So it's a way to make sure the ground can handle the load.
Precisely.
All right, question 62 is a practical scenario. To lift a load of 12 tons on a 2-point lift using single-leg slings, what is the required safe working load for each sling with an included angle of 87 degrees? And please explain your calculation.
Okay, so when you're using angled slings, you have to adjust the capacity.
Yeah.
To find the required SWL for each sling, you divide the load weight 12 tons by the mode factor for 87 degrees,
Okay.
which is approximately 1.414.
All right.
So that means each sling needs a minimum SWL of 8.49 tons for a safe lift.
Okay, so the sling angle really impacts the capacity.
Exactly. You always need to factor that in.
All right. Question 63 asks us to list 4 items to be found on a chain sling inspection certificate.
That certificate should include the inspection date, the sling's unique identification number, a detailed description of the sling, and any defects found during the inspection.
So it's like a report card for the sling.
Exactly. It tells you everything you need to know about its condition and history.
Okay. Question 64 is about leaving the crane. If the operator has to leave the cab for a short period state, at least 2 actions that must be taken before they leave.
Even for a short break, the operator needs to secure the crane.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that involve?
Removing any load from the hook or grounding it, disconnecting the power supply, applying the brakes, and removing the keys.
So preventing any accidents or unauthorized use.
Exactly. It's about leaving the crane in a safe and secure state.
All right. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this section, from sling angles and load calculations to the broader responsibilities of the crane supervisor.
It's all part of ensuring safe and efficient lifting operations.
Let's take one last break before we wrap up this deep dive and explore those final few questions. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive.
All right, let's finish strong.
Okay, so question 65 asks us to explain the difference between a contract lift and a standard crane hire.
It all comes down to responsibility. In a contract lift, the crane company takes on the whole shebang, planning, execution, everything. They provide the crane, the operator, the expertise, the whole 9 yards.
So they're handling everything.
Exactly. While with a standard crane hire, they just provide the crane and the operator. The customer is responsible for the rest.
So it's like a full service versus a DIY option.
Yeah, you could say that.
All right, question 66. If a task detailed in the method statement for a lift has to be amended, who is authorized to do this?
That would be the appointed person. They're the only ones who can sign off on any changes to the method statement.
Okay. So it's not something the crane supervisor can just decide on their own.
Nope. Any changes need to go through the proper channels.
Makes sense. Question 67. If a crane supervisor has to leave the lifting operation for a short time, who should be appointed to supervise in their place?
They need to appoint a competent person to take over the supervisory role.
Okay, so there's always someone in charge.
Absolutely. You can't just leave a lifting operation unsupervised.
Right. And finally, question 68. During a lifting operation, who is responsible for ensuring the safety of pedestrians in the vicinity of the lift?
The crane supervisor has the primary duty to make sure pedestrians are safe.
Okay, so they're in charge of keeping everyone clear.
Exactly. They need to set up exclusion zones, control access, and make sure people are aware of the hazards.
So, a lot of responsibility there.
Yeah, it's a crucial part of the role.
Well, there you have it. We've explored all 68 theory questions and delved into the ins and outs of the crane lifting operations supervisor role.
It's been a fascinating journey through the world of crane operations.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground, from safety regulations and equipment specifics to practical calculations and risk assessments.
It's all about ensuring those lifting operations are carried out safely and efficiently.
And that's what makes this role so important.
Absolutely. It's a demanding job, but a crucial one.
I hope this deep dive has given you a solid foundation for further learning.
Remember, these questions are just the starting point.
Yeah, keep exploring those resources and never stop learning.
And always strive to be the best crane supervisor you can be.
That's a great note to end on.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of crane lifting operations supervision.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.